Hey there, my name is Soundrak and welcome to the third installment in my Path of Exile guide for total beginners. These guides are for players who are completely new to Path of Exile or who, for whatever reason, never got very far into the game. In this video, I'll cover a variety of topics that will help you get unstuck if you're having trouble finishing the campaign or getting off to a good start in the endgame, including how to trade with other players, how to fix problems with your build, and we'll also explain in more detail how items work in the game. As with all my guide videos, timestamps are down in the description, as are links to other resources you might find useful. And if you find this video helpful, informative, or at the very least somewhat entertaining, please hit that like button and maybe share it with a friend. Now let's get to it. To start things off, I want to talk about how to trade in Path of Exile, and specifically, how to buy items from other players. Now, I personally think it's a great idea to learn how to finish the campaign completely on your own without trading, even if you aren't playing in solo self-found. But as you get further into the game, maybe towards the end of the campaign, and especially as you start exploring the endgame and following build guides, there will be times where a good purchase can significantly benefit your character. Maybe it's a higher DPS weapon, plugging a hole in your resistances, or getting an item for a specific slot that has the right number and colors of linked sockets, such as a 6-link chest piece. Path of Exile is a bit unusual for a game that has trading, in that the game itself does almost nothing to facilitate the trade economy. There's no in-game auction house where items are listed to be bought and sold, and instead each trade transaction has to be performed by two online players directly with each other. In terms of finding an item you might want to buy, you'll need to go to the game's website, pathofexile.com, and then click the Trade button to go to the search page. Make sure you have your platform and the league of your character selected, and then click the Filters button to fine-tune your selection. For this example, I'm going to be looking for a 6-link body armor upgrade for a level 73 trickster who recently beat the campaign but is struggling in early maps. Now, this is going to be a purely hypothetical example, as this character is actually in the standard solo self-found league and won't be able to actually trade. I'm just using him as an example, in part to highlight the differences between the economies of the various leagues. And for now, we'll just pretend that he's in the Challenge League, which is currently Sanctum. To start out, I'll hit the Show Filters button to the right of the Search button, and then I'll click the boxes to make sure the following filter options are visible: Type, Armor, Socket, and Requirements. For type, I'll enter Body Armor for the item category filter, and leave the rarity as any, as I want to see what all is available. In the socket filters, I'll enter the number of each color of socket I want to have linked, and in this case, it will be 1 red, 1 green, and 4 blue. Since it won't do me much good to buy an item I can't even use yet, I enter the character's level and current attributes into the requirements section, and then I hit search, and right off the bat, I can see that for a few chaos orbs there's quite a few options. At this point, I could just scroll through the list to find something that appeals to me, or I could further refine the search if, for example, there were mods like specific resistances or increased maximum life that I want the item to have. So let's add a minimum of 25 to lightning resistance and 40 to maximum life and see what we get. And right away, the options are generally quite a bit more expensive with these mods added, and are too rich for the blood of my trickster who had found 9 chaos orbs by the end of the campaign. But what would the prices look like if I was instead trying to buy an item in the Standard League? Astronomically more expensive. Because the Standard League has players with years upon years of accumulated wealth, the market tends to be quite inflated for most items, though you can sometimes find inexpensive items like good leveling uniques. But as I noted in my first video of this series, I don't think your choice of league really matters a whole lot on your first character or two, as you likely won't be engaging in trade much anyways. But to the extent that you do end up wanting to trade, which you'll probably want to do once you start following build guides and exploring the endgame, then most likely you will want to use a character in the Challenge League where prices tend to be quite a bit lower for most items. Getting back to the logistics of performing a trade, I'm going to switch now to an account I created for making these videos, and will be looking for a gold rim unique leather cap for my level 50 witch in the Standard League. Goldrim is a great leveling item as it provides a boatload of elemental resistances, and even in the standard league it's usually pretty cheap. So to do a trade, once you've found an item you want, make sure you are logged into the game and in-game with a character, and then you can offer to buy the item by simply clicking the Direct Whisper button, which will send an in-game whisper to the seller, letting them know you want to buy that specific item. Once you've been invited to a party by the seller, click the Accept button, make sure you have the right amount and type of currency needed in your player inventory, and then click the little portal button on the bottom left corner of their party profile image to move to the seller's hideout. Once you've loaded into their hideout, it's considered proper trading etiquette to wait for the seller to initiate the trade, as they might need some time to find the right item or shift things around in their inventory if they were out looting somewhere. Click Yes to accept the trade request, then Control left click your currency to move it into the trade window. Before either player can accept the trade, each player must first mouse over the items they're going to receive, and this is a good time to make sure you are in fact getting the correct merchandise. Once you've confirmed it's the correct item, click Accept, and once the seller has done the same, voila! You've successfully traded for an item. Let's shift gears now and talk about common problems that might cause you to get stuck while progressing through the main story campaign or afterwards, either because you're dying all the time or aren't killing enemies fast enough. The most common reasons for hitting a brick wall in Path of Exile include some combination of the following: gameplay mistakes, bad gear, bad skill gem choices, both active and support, and bad passive skill selections. Let's start with gameplay mistakes. There are lots of ways to get yourself killed in Path of Exile in terms of your gameplay, so here are 3 general tips that will help you to stay alive longer. Tip number 1, stay mobile. Demonstrated by Hillock, the very first boss in the game, most attacks leveled against you in Path of Exile can be avoided simply by moving out of the way. You can literally run circles around Hillock and never get hit, only pausing after he misses an attack to fire off attacks of your own. Throughout the game, you'll be able to avoid the vast majority of incoming damage simply by moving out of the way. For this reason, as well as general time efficiency running through zones, movement speed on boots is almost mandatory, and every character both in the campaign and beyond should probably be using a Quicksilver Flask to get around quicker. Movement abilities like Shield Charge, Leap Slam, Flame Dash, Frost Blink, and others are also great for getting out of harm's way quickly, and when possible, you should try to find an item or other means to avoid or negate getting frozen, as a frozen character is often a dead character, particularly if there are lots of monsters around. Easiest option for freeze immunity is to re-roll a flask using Alteration Orbs to get a modifier that grants immunity to freeze and chill if used when frozen or chilled. And such a mod can also be added to a flask that doesn't have a suffix using beast crafting at Einhar's Menagerie. I'll talk more about item crafting and affixes in a bit. Closely related to this tip is tip number 2, don't stand in fire or other things that are going to kill you. There are tons of on-ground effects that will cause you to take damage over time so long as you remain on them, and other effects that will slow you down or make you take extra damage from all damage sources. The danger of most of these can be negated through high resistances, ailment immunities, and so forth, but in general, if you see something odd looking on the ground, don't stand on it. Closely related to on-ground effects, there are also lots of monsters that will have the ability to send out various homing orbs of death that will follow you around, pause over your head, and then drop down to kill you. Be aware of these types of effects, let them get over you, and then get out of the way fast so you can avoid their damage entirely. And finally, tip number 3, use your flasks. Flasks are an extremely powerful part of your loadout and should be used regularly and preferably before you're already dead. Most of the time, life and mana flasks will give restoration gradually over time, though there are some modifiers that make the recovery instant, but either way, you should generally use these flasks as your bubbles start going down and not once they're almost depleted. Similarly, there are a ton of useful utility flasks that can significantly boost your offensive and defensive capabilities, and the benefits of these flasks can be further enhanced by rolling good modifiers on them. I already mentioned earlier that it's a good idea to keep a flask around that will thaw you out if you get chilled or frozen, but other good options are ones that remove damage over time effects, such as bleeding, burning, and poison, or even curse removal. Later on in the game, there are ways to automate your flasks so they'll activate on their own, such as when their charges are full or other criteria are met, but during the campaign it's not a bad idea to get in the habit of using them regularly, which is why in the last video I recommended changing the key bindings to something more comfortable. Moving on to the other problems you may encounter, I already talked earlier about how to trade for gear, and in the last video talked about how you should prioritize items based on sockets, life, and resistances. But how can you tell if you need to upgrade your gear, fix your gem layouts, fix your passive skills, or some combination of the three? Well, it's not always super simple, as these three aspects of your character are pretty closely intertwined. But here are some general pointers with respect to your gear. In terms of survivability, your basic life and energy shield pool can be thought of as your most critical line of defense, and as a general rule of thumb, you should shoot for having 300 to 400 combined total life and energy shield per act of the main story. So if you're in Act 6, you would want to shoot for between 1800 and 2400 combined life and energy shield. For most of the main story, maintaining these energy shield and life levels and keeping your resistances capped at 75% each for fire, cold, and lightning, and at least 0% for chaos, though more is always better, is generally enough to keep you alive most of the time. But towards the end of the campaign, and certainly as you start moving into endgame maps, resistances, life, and energy shield alone will not be enough to keep you standing, and you'll need to weave in additional layers of defense from your gear, skill gems, and the passive skill tree. But how do you do that? Well, defensive layers is actually a pretty complicated topic and one on which I'm no expert, but here are a few pointers to at least get you through the campaign. For starters, while leveling through the game, you may have noticed that there are 6 categories of armor in terms of their stat requirements and the types of defensive benefits they provide. And even within the same category, there are lots of different options. For example, with body armors, there are 17 different types of armors within each of the 6 categories of armor. So 17 different strength-based armors, 17 different dex-based armors, and 17 different hybrid intelligence strength armors, and so on and so forth. In each of these categories, as the character level and stat requirements to wear the armor increases, so too do the defensive bonuses, with top tier armor being magnitudes better than bottom rung options. And when you further multiply these base values against stat boosters from gear modifiers and passive tree skills, the value of higher tier equipment becomes even more dramatic. So if you're finding yourself getting killed a lot, one of the first places you should look for a fix is your gear to determine if there are higher tier armor bases you can start to use based on your level and attributes. This concept of upgrading base items also applies to weapons and is particularly important for builds that use attack skills, where the attack damage of the weapon itself is a critical component of your total DPS output. For example, if you're in Act 8 but are still using a wood splitter axe that you got in Act 2, simply upgrading to a higher tier weapon might instantly quadruple your damage or more. Higher tier weapons can also be important for spell-based builds, but it usually isn't as critical, as the weapon itself generally doesn't have as large an impact on your damage output as it does for attack-based builds. As for ballpark rules of thumb, by the time you're most of the way done with Act 1, you should generally be killing packs of white monsters in 1, maybe 2 uses of your primary skills. And as you get past Act 2, you should definitely be killing white monsters in a single use. Blue monsters by Act 2 onwards will maybe take 2 to 4 uses of your main skill, while yellow monsters will be highly variable depending on what mods they have on them. Most of the time though, your damage will primarily be coming from your skill gems, which we'll get to in a minute, as this is probably a good time to talk a little bit more about how items actually work. In addition to a wide variety of base items, there are 4 different rarities an item can have. And for 3 of these rarities, the type of rarity determines how many magical modifiers can be present on the item. On the bottom level are normal, white colored items, and these are items that do not have any magical modifiers. Blue colored magical items can have at least one and at most two magical modifiers on the item, a single prefix modifier, a single suffix modifier, or both, and the name of the item will be composed of the name of the base item along with the names of those magical affixes. By contrast, yellow colored rare items can have up to 3 prefixes and or 3 suffixes, but the name of the item will be something completely arbitrary and random. Whether magic or rare, you can see detailed information about the item's modifiers by holding Alt while hovering over the item, which will show you whether the mods are prefixes or suffixes, the range of values a given modifier can potentially have, and the tier of the modifier, with top tiers being more powerful than lower numbered tiers. In terms of the types of modifiers an item can potentially have when randomly found in the game or crafted through basic methods, they can be restricted by the type of item, though most modifiers can appear on a variety of different base item types. For example, increased cast speed, a great stat for characters using spell skills, can appear on weapons generally associated with spellcasters like wands and scepters, but won't show up on typical attack weapons like swords and axes. By contrast, a more generally useful stat like plus to maximum life can show up on all types of armor and accessories, but won't be found on any weapons. And as far as the tiers of mods, these are restricted by an item's level, with higher level items being needed to get the best tiers of modifiers in most cases. Now most of this stuff you only really need to know and understand when you start learning to craft higher end items, which is a very advanced topic far beyond what you need to know when learning the game as a beginner. But it can be relevant when using the search filters on the trade website to find items to buy from other players. So if you're looking for an item with a specific base type or category that has a specific modifier and nothing shows up in the search results, there's a good chance that the mod you are hoping to find can't exist on that item type. More relevant to new players though is the fact that rare items can have up to 3 prefixes and 3 suffixes, and this is important because if an item is full on prefixes and or suffixes, then you won't be able to bench craft anything else onto the item using the crafting bench in your hideout. Keep that in mind, especially when purchasing items from other players, as having an open suffix will allow you to add needed resistances or a core attribute, and having an open prefix will allow you to add life to non-weapons or something else good for your character. As for unique items, well, they are unique and will generally have a fixed set of mods that cannot be altered. And unfortunately, the vast majority of unique items are also completely worthless. So unless you have a premium unique stash tab, which I'll talk about in the next video, when you do find a unique item, take a quick look at it to see if it might be good for your character or another character you might be working on or thinking of making. And if it isn't, just sell it to a vendor, otherwise you'll fill up your stash really quickly. In the next video, I'll also explain how to quickly price check items to make sure you don't accidentally vendor something that is actually valuable. Now, regardless of an item's rarity, many items have what is called an implicit modifier, which is directly tied to the specific base item type. For example, most wands have an implicit modifier of increased spell damage, with higher tier items having stronger implicit modifiers. Item types that don't have implicit modifiers will generally have higher base stats, such as defensive stats for armor pieces and higher base damage for weapons. So for example, one-handed axes, which mostly have no implicit modifier, will have higher base DPS tier by tier than one-handed maces, which do have implicit modifiers. As for the base stats of an item, such as attack damage for weapons or defensive stats for armor, these can be improved by adding quality to the item, which is most easily done using a blacksmith's whetstone for weapons or an armorer's scrap for armor. However, the effectiveness of these items is greatest on normal items, where one whetstone or armorer's scrap will improve the quality by 5%, whereas on magic items it's only 2% and only 1% for rare or unique items. Item quality also improves your chances of getting more sockets and of linking your sockets, and is especially valuable when trying to get 5 or 6 sockets or links rolled onto an item. though even then the chances are extremely low. In general, during the campaign you should only use your Jeweler's Orbs and Orbs of Fusing to get up to 4 linked sockets, which usually isn't too hard, as you don't really need more than that for the campaign, and you'll likely end up using all your orbs without getting more than 4 sockets or links anyways. The explicit modifiers of an item, which are the magical prefixes and suffixes, can be manipulated and changed through a variety of methods, all of which are considered part of Path of Exile's crafting system. For example, a normal item can be upgraded to magical by using an Orb of Transmutation, and if it only has a single affix, the missing one can be added using an Orb of Augmentation. A magical item can be completely re-rolled using an Orb of Alteration, and using Orbs of Alteration and Augmentation is one of the best ways to get good mods on your flasks, which can't be rare and thus can't have more than 2 modifiers. If you find a good normal base item, it can be upgraded to rare using an Orb of Alchemy, but a better option would be to use an Essence. These are a special type of currency item that are obtained by freeing and defeating frozen monsters that can be randomly found throughout the campaign and in maps. Using an Essence on an item will always result in a rare item that is guaranteed to have a specific modifier based on the type of essence used and the type of item it is used on. For example, Essences of Greed used on Armour will always give you a rare item that has plus maximum life on it, and chances are there will be 1 or 2 other good mods on the item as well. And if the item ends up having an open prefix and or suffix, even better, as you'll be able to add another good mod using your crafting bench. There are a wide variety of mods you can get using essences, and since low tier essences aren't particularly valuable, go ahead and use them on a good normal base item, as you have much better chances of getting something good with an essence than you do with an Orb of Alchemy, or even random rare items picked up off the ground. Note that lower tier essences can only be used on normal items, but essences that are screaming or higher can be used on normal and on rare items, and is a common way to get some pretty decent gear. Modifiers on a rare item can be further adjusted by a variety of means, but during the campaign I wouldn't recommend it, as the currency items themselves, such as Exalted Orbs that add a modifier to a rare item, or Chaos Orbs to completely re-roll a rare item, are generally quite hard to find, but are also far more valuable for trading with other players. And please, please, please don't even think about using a Divine Orb on any of your items in the campaign if you're even lucky enough to have found one, as they are one of the most valuable trading currencies in the game and are also used for complex and advanced crafting methods. I'll also mention that corrupted items, commonly found in Vol side areas or created by using a Vol Orb on an uncorrupted item, break the normal rules of items in a variety of ways. Corrupted items can sometimes have special Vol Implicit Modifiers and can have 1 or more white colored sockets into which any colored gem can be placed. Corrupted items also have a much higher chance of having 6 linked sockets, but the main drawback of corrupted items is that they cannot be modified through most normal crafting methods, including adding mods with your crafting bench. If you find a good corrupted item, feel free to use it, but I generally wouldn't recommend ever using Vol Orbs on any of your items while playing through the campaign, as doing so can sometimes have very undesirable effects, such as completely re-rolling the item or converting a unique item back to rare. Getting back to fixing problems related to bad gear, here's the key points to keep in mind. Higher tier items are always potentially better than lower tier items because higher tier weapons will have better DPS and or stronger implicit modifiers, and higher tier armor will have better defensive stats. Gear with higher item levels will generally always be better than lower item levels because higher level items can have stronger tiers of modifiers. And rare items will generally always be better than normal or magical items because they can have more modifiers, including bench crafted mods if there is an open prefix and or suffix. Unique items are generally worthless but need to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis, as some can be extremely powerful even during the campaign. And other than re-rolling flasks using essences or trying to get up to 4 linked sockets or needed colors for your sockets, during the campaign it's generally not a good idea to use your currency items to craft or otherwise tweak your items unless you know what you're doing, such as you're following a clearly explained method, say from a build guide. And finally, if a rare item has an open prefix or suffix, you should probably go ahead and add something else using your crafting bench in your hideout, and as you learn new and more powerful recipes, be sure to upgrade your bench crafted modifiers. Let's shift gears now and talk about how to fix bad gem and passive skill layouts. As you already know, linking support gems to your most important active skills, and especially your main damage dealing ability, is critically important to your overall power and effectiveness. But given the sometimes dozens of eligible support gems that can potentially be used, and especially the hundreds of passive skill tree options, how do you figure out which ones work best? Well, you can certainly experiment, and through enough trial and error, you'll eventually come up with some good combinations, maybe? The problem with this approach, though, is that it's hard to get solid in-game feedback. For skill gems, if you just go buy a new support from Siosa or Lily Roth, it will start at level 1 and will have to get up to par with your other gems in order for you to get a fair comparison. The other problem is that the in-game tooltip information is generally regarded as being pretty inaccurate, and it can be hard to gauge whether one support skill is better than another using in-game performance fighting monsters, as there's just too many other variables that can come into play. And as for fixing your passive skill tree, during the campaign the availability of passive refund points is pretty limited, and although you'll eventually start to accumulate Orbs of Regret, the currency item that grants passive skill refund points, these are also generally pretty scarce during the campaign. So to help you figure out ways to improve your gem layout and passive skill tree without spinning your wheels and running in circles, I want to introduce you to a website that will help you to quickly find some answers. As I've mentioned many times throughout these videos, Path of Exile is an extremely complex game, and learning its ins and outs solely through your own efforts is extremely difficult, if not impossible. Now, getting through the campaign mostly on your own is, I would guess, a pretty reasonable goal for most gamers, though some people may tend to struggle more than others. Getting far into the endgame though, solely through your own efforts and in a reasonable amount of time, is extremely unlikely for the vast majority of gamers. Consequently, one of the best ways to learn about what works well in this game is to at least take a look at what other more experienced players are actually doing. And for that, you're going to want to take a look at a website called poe.ninja. This website has a ton of information about what players are doing in the game, ranging from economic data showing the listed trade values for all sorts of items to character builds over time within the current and most recent challenge leagues. And one of the best ways to fix problems with your character is to look at other characters that are doing things right, or at least better than you are. To do that, go to poe.ninja and then click the build link at the top. Then at the top of the page, adjust the league to match the current league, whether you're playing in it or not, make sure the ladder is set to experience, and then change the time machine to day 1 or maybe 2 of the league. This is so that the characters listed will be new characters in a brand new league situation and won't be max level or already pimped out with all sorts of uber fancy endgame gear. From there, you'll want to further refine the list by selecting your character's ascendancy and maybe filter for the primary skill that you are using. If you can't find any matches, then there's a good chance you're using a bad skill for your ascendancy, or maybe a skill that just doesn't do well past the early stages of the game, and we'll want to look at the main skills listed along the left side of the page to see what sorts of primary skills other players are actually using. So for example, suppose you've decided to play as a trickster and have been leveling up using the Freezing Pulse spell, which is great for at least the first several acts of the game. Turns out though that on day 1 of this league there weren't any higher level tricksters using Freezing Pulse. But by looking at the skills that the top day 1 tricksters were using, you will see that there are several other cold dealing spells being used, including Vortex, Creeping Frost, Frost Blades, and Cold Snap. So this might be a clue that switching up your main skill might be a good idea, and is certainly worth a try. Once you've found a list of characters that either match your ascendancy and main skill, or at least have a compatible main skill damage type, the next step is to look at several different characters to see what skills these characters are using and then compare them to your own. By scrolling down, you can see where and in what combinations they've socketed their skill gems, and this will give you some good ideas of both active and support gems you might want to try incorporating into your build. Be sure to take a look at their gear and note any unique items that are frequently used by multiple characters from your list, or specific types of modifiers they might share. You'll also want to take a look at their passive skill trees, and if you click the link on the top right of the snapshot, it will open up a full tree that you can then compare to your own. Now, there are several ways to skin the proverbial cat in terms of skill gems and the passive skill tree, so don't be surprised if there's a high degree of variability between the builds you're looking at. But you'll want to pay particular attention to passive skills that are frequently taken by multiple characters on the website, as well as skills that you have taken for your character but these experienced players haven't. And if nothing else, looking at these builds from other players should give you some new ideas of things that you might want to try. But that's it for this episode. If you haven't been able to complete the main campaign yet, you should definitely be able to do it now as you put the principles explained in this guide into practice. And if you haven't done so already, please help me out and remember to hit that like button. Let me know down in the comments if you have any questions, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers!